Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, Maajid. It's great to see you.
This is the, for everyone here, this is the third time we've shared a stage together. And we were told today that this is going to be a friendly conversation. The only thing we're missing is a fireside here. But I thought I'd kick off with a question, if I may. And that is, if it's interesting to me that we met on the opposite sides of a debate. And that was the first time we met. The second time we met, we were on a panel, and it wasn't a debate. And then the third time we met was something special. So I don't know, maybe you want to speak a bit about that, because it's special to me, and I'll add on as you speak. I'll sort of add some anecdotes.
So, Maajid, it's wonderful to see you, and you are giving me the difficult task now of testing our new friendship.
Yes.
The first time we met was opposite one another on a podium known as Intelligence Squared, and the proposition was Islam is a religion of peace. And Maajid was opposing that. And
supporting it.
You were supporting it.
Yes.
Maajid was supporting it. Yeah, Maajid was supporting it. I was opposing it. Good to get that right.
Yes.
And what leads to the third bit, which is much more intimate, is Maajid's wife met him on that night, and that was October 6, 2010. This was before ISIS.
You remember the date? I didn't remember that date.
I do.
Wow.
It was a big deal. I don't do Intelligence Squared every night, so you remember something like that. And I remember it was you and a young woman who looked very modern and was very modern. And we disagreed passionately. And you met there after the event, my friend Sam Harris. And the two of you got so angry at one another that at some point I thought you were going to punch his face. Yeah. Thank goodness you didn't.
Oh, he would have. He's actually a really good martial artist. He would have really beaten me up.
Yeah.
I since learned that he practices mixed martial arts.
Yeah.
So thank goodness I didn't.
So the second time we met was in Richmond, Virginia. I do not remember the date, but what I do remember was really being stunned, because the more you spoke next to us, but with us was an imam, the imam who wanted to build the Ground Zero Mosque in New York. His name is Raif.
Imam Faisal.
Faisal
Yeah.
Abdul Rauf.
Yeah.
Faisal Abdul Rauf. And Faisal Abdul Rauf reminds me in many ways of the villains from Wilkie Collins. I don't know if you've ever read any of those books, but kind of this quiet guy, wears a suit, talks to you the way you want to be spoken to, tells you what you expect, but you can't quite trust him. And of course, I didn't trust the imam, but I was also very cautious of you.
Yeah.
And as the evening went by and you started to say things, I thought, wow, Maajid, you've changed, and that is good. And I think that's the effect of dialogue. And now, and this is the third time we had dinner as friends with Sam Harris, you and Sam have this dialogue going on about Islam. Not as a religion of peace, but Islam as a religion, as a civilization, as a culture that needs reform. And I welcome that. And the more we talk about these things today, and look, I mean, I started getting interested in this subject after 9/11/2001, but the more you look at it, the more you see that on the one hand, there's this global level, it's geopolitical. If you look at Syria, the involvement of Iran and Saudi Arabia in Syria, the masses of immigrants coming from that part of the world, how things could really get worse, how Russia is involved, Turkey shoots down a Russian plane. You take all of that and you see the geopolitical consequences of that. It's big, it's macro. But this clash between, and this opposition between, say, Western civilization and Islamic civilization is also something you see in your neighborhood, in the classroom, on the streets. And every time, you go from the global to the micro, and you're confronted with layer after layer after layer of complexity. And I don't know if we can deal with all those layers of complexity in 30 minutes. But we have to be aware as we discuss this and as we analyze it and as we continue to live together that it is extremely complicated.
Yes, and just to fill in some of the, from my perspective on that, how we met, I agree with you. When we first met, it was more adversarial, and the second time, I think just there's something that struck my mind at the Richmond Forum, which is the second time we spoke publicly, and that was that the moderator interjected at one stage and said to Ayaan, but you're an ex-Muslim, you've left the religion, so what right do you have to speak about Islam? Because of course the second one was also called, Is Islam a Religion of War or Peace? Even though it wasn't a debate, it had the same title with the same moderator. You notice he's not here today. So he at that point interjected and asked Ayaan, asked you, what right do you have to speak? And that angered me. Whatever had happened between those 2 years of our first meeting and our second meeting, I suppose, you know, I'm still on a journey. But that angered me because I interjected and said, hold on, that's unfair of you to say that. Because we, as Muslims, mustn't delegitimize the voices of those who have grown up with our experience, who have grown up in the community, and who have decided, for whatever reason, to criticize the faith. Actually, their existence is a lesson for us, and it's our problem, not their problem, that as Muslims, as Muslim communities, we have to get used to the fact that people will criticize the idea called Islam, which is very different to picking on individual Muslims, which I call anti-Muslim bigotry. I've often said, and in my dialogue that you referred to with Sam, I've said that no idea should ever be above scrutiny. And no people and no person should be beneath dignity. So I then interjected, and there's, I think that probably indicated to you that my own thinking was evolving around this. But there's another meeting which, allow me, I suppose, Ayaan left it to me because it's more personal to me. There's another meeting which was a rather more memorable one for me, at least. I hope you haven't forgotten it. So my wife Rachel is here somewhere. She only attended that first debate to come and see you. She hadn't heard of me; she knew who I was, and actually voted for you in the debate as well. She since assures me that she voted on a technicality, and that was apparently my debating partner wasn't pulling her weight. But that's not for me to judge. But actually, we met only because of that debate, and that led to a relationship which eventually ended in a marriage, and you attended our wedding as a guest. And at the wedding, you also met the Quilliam Reform theologian, Dr. Osama Hassan, who's here in the audience as well. And I think that personalized relationship, for me, is indicative of how I'd like this debate to go if I have a hand in it. And that is that somebody like me, who's come from an Islamist background, who served time in prison for my revolutionary extremist Islamist ideas, and the journey that I've been on, and even when we first met, considering that journey, that we met as adversaries, and Sam Harris as well, to end up at a point where we have developed, I'd like to think, not just an understanding about how we can move this debate forward, but a friendship that is built on that, I think is what I'd like to see replicated across the world when it comes to the way Muslims should not just tolerate ex-Muslims, that's a disgusting way to look at it, but actually offer them, confer to them the utmost respect and civility as human beings who have every right to their opinions and to their right to scrutinize the culture and the faith that they grew up in, as anyone else has the right to scrutinize that. And your last book, I think, is an example of how we can move this debate forward.
And Maajid, it's wonderful, and I think that's a wonderful development in our friendship, in our relationship, and how we can move the dialogue. There is one principle, however, that I think is under threat in the free world, in the Western world, and if that's not defended, then we cannot have this dialogue or any other dialogue in peace. The fact that you have someone protecting you, that I have people protecting me, and that we can't just talk about a set of ideas in the United Kingdom is shameful. It angers me. It makes my blood boil. It is the rule of law. It is freedom of conscience. It's freedom of speech. I had, and I believe I have every right to scrutinize the moral upbringing that my parents gave me. and as an adult, the freedom to leave it if I wish to do so. And they may be angry, they may criticize me, but they have absolutely no right to threaten my life.
Absolutely.
Or threaten yours. So for us in the free Western world, I'm not talking about Muslim majority countries, I'm not talking about the third world, I'm not talking about China, but in free societies where we thought that this was established and taken for granted, there is a threat to the rule of law and a threat to the freedom of speech. And only if we protect that, so we don't give in to either the lobbyists from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation countries who want to criminalize speech. We should not give in to them. We should resist them. We should explain to them why our principles of free speech matter. That's number one. And number two, we should also take every kind of physical threat to an opinion. So that's one way of moving it. And I think that Islam presented to us either by the jihadists, and I'm talking about Islam as a political idea, either presented by the jihadists or presented by these organized at the state level, that both of these threaten the freedom of speech. Iran has just
renewed
the fatwa.
Yeah.
So if in 1989 we had been unequivocal about protecting Salman Rushdie's rights, to write that book, I think we would have been in a better place if we had taken this seriously and we could have seen it coming. And a decade later, we could have seen it coming.
Yeah.
So that is number one. Number two, I think one problem now as the world meets, we live in a world where we are globalizing at a fast pace. And in that, for those of us who live in the West, we're used to framing everything in terms of everything political and cultural, in terms of left and right. And to be quite honest with you, there are things that simply don't fit in there, because that framework of left and right and middle, it is not non-Western, it's only Western. So if you're grappling with the issue of political Islam, jihadism, da'wah, that sort of thing, it just doesn't fit in there. And what happens as a side effect, and maybe intended by the far left, maybe intended by the far right, I don't know. But once you try to squeeze this big global civilizational issue into that very narrow framework of left and right, you are then left with the left calling everyone a racist that don't agree with them. And the right expressing themselves, the far right expressing themselves only in nationalistic terms. And as they continue to do that, as they continue to eat one another, hate one another, this big, enormous tsunami of problems is coming at us, and we're not having the opportunity to discuss that in a way that we are protected.
I call that the triple threat in Europe. I talk about the threat of the populist and the far right. I talk about the threat of Islamism, and I talk about the threat of what I call the regressive left. And we spoke a bit about that before. What I mean by the regressive left, both you and I have fallen prey to their insidious means. And it's a section of the left who, in the name of respecting cultural diversity, in the name of multiculturalism, in the name of political correctness, in the name of anti-racism, in the name of challenging Islamophobia, would prefer, it's almost an authoritarian response, would prefer to silence and shut down debate than offend communities from people that are from minority ethnic backgrounds. And anyone who then, the reason I'm focusing on these guys, by the way, is I've grown up, neo-Nazis have chased me in Essex with hammers and knives and have stabbed my friends. I am used to neo-Nazis not liking me. And of course, I know Islamists intimately. I know they won't like me. I know they consider me a traitor to their cause. What I didn't expect when we first founded Quilliam was that those who pander to universalist rhetoric, talk about human rights and the principles you've just talked about, the importance of free speech, I didn't expect them to turn on you and me the way that they have. And I emphasize it's a section within the left, so I call them the regressive left, but they've often, in the name of these things, anti-racism, cultural tolerance and diversity, have decided, and I call it the bigotry of low expectations, they have decided to not just tolerate, but champion all forms of bigotry when it comes from minority community contexts in the name of cultural diversity, and silence those who within those minorities are themselves minorities. The minorities within the minority communities, yeah? The ex-Muslims, the feminist Muslims, the liberal Muslims, the minority sects like the Ahmadiyya community. There are a whole bunch of minorities within Muslim minority community contexts who are attempting to challenge the hegemony, but because the regressive left says, what do the Muslims think? And if you're not speaking in that way, well, you're not speaking the way the Muslims are meant to be speaking, so he must be either Islamophobic or racist. I mean, have you been called a racist ever? I have.
Hard time calling me racist. I'm blacker than they are.
Yeah, exactly. Look, there's a reason. I promised you I'd explain to you why I brought...
female, so...
Yeah, absolutely. There's a reason. I promised you I'd explain why I brought a coffee out with me, right? And this is me. Seriously, guys, this is me acting defiant here. Right? The reason is the last time an interview in The Guardian happened, the journalist made the absurd decision to focus on my dress and the fact that I was drinking a coffee to demonstrate that I'm not authentic enough as a Muslim. Right? So just recently in Australia, I promised you I'd explain this. Recently in Australia, I was asked about it, so I made a vow, a bit like Christopher Hitchens never spoke without a whiskey, right? I said, I promise never to be on stage again without a coffee in my hand, just to stick it to them. You know, what were they expecting? That I should be drinking curry sauce and speaking in a different language, right? That's what we're dealing with, seriously. I mean, have you faced any of this?
Oh, I faced and you know, at some point you get used to it and you develop a thick skin.
Yeah.
I've faced that, you know, you are traumatized.
Yeah.
You had a bad childhood, so you have nothing to say of interest on the subject of Islam, even though you're not allowed to leave it, because if you leave it, you're going to be killed. I think it is nonsensical. I think it's a hindrance. I do not like the far left. I do not like the far right. I don't like any extremes. But for those of us who are in the middle, at least assuming that we're all in the middle, I think that if we ignore them, and let them not frame the debate, let them not dictate the debate, we have to settle down and start talking about how it is that the fabric of our own societies is threatened. We talk a lot about minorities. Yes, Muslims in the UK are a minority for now. Muslims in Germany are a minority. Muslims in the US are a minority. But if you take the globe, then Muslims are not a minority. They are 1/5 of humanity. It is a very aggressive religion and civilization. It wants to expand. It's expansionist. It's misogynist. They hate women. Anti-Semitism, we thought was gone forever, but it's back. And all this is pushed very radically with a lot of resources by people I call the Medina Muslims, because they want to replicate what the Prophet Muhammad did in Medina way back. They're very political. We need to get that. And in order not only to get it, but to discuss it openly and to fight it and push back, we need to have a very honest conversation.
Absolutely.
Now, you look at incidents like the one on New Year's Eve in Cologne, Germany, and other German cities, but also in Scandinavia, and in this country also, has been going on for a long time. Little girls, as young as 10 years, have been subjected to rape, were abused, and that is racist, by men who formed gangs who would only prey on white little girls. I don't think they were doing this as a matter of religion. It wasn't their religion, but they were doing it because they come from a culture where women mean nothing, they're chattel. And as this is going on, if the police and the politicians and the social workers, the people who are supposed to protect these young people, we pay taxes so that we can be protected. If they sweep this under the rug, then are we not empowering the regressive left, the far right, and the radical Islamists? And we're not doing this only in the UK. We're doing it all over Europe, and we're doing it in the United States. And yes, once in a while, someone like a Donald Trump pops up and starts to repeat a sentiment that is very angry coming from the population. And if we want to have an intelligent conversation, but all the process, all this time that we could have had this intelligent conversation, we close the doors to that.
Yeah,
and we close it down, and then and what we are left with at some point is just options that are all just not good.
Often people have, the statement you just made about Muslim culture, often people have accused you of generalizing.
Yeah.
So I want to give some statistics of Britain, because we're obviously in London, and I think the stats themselves in survey after survey speak to this truth, which is why my own thinking evolved. When we first met, I was arguing Islam is a religion of peace. I now advocate very openly that it's either neither a religion of peace or war, or both, meaning because it's interpreted in many ways, and so how we judge it today is by how Muslims respond to their scripture today. So some stats, and this is in multiple surveys, we've gauged opinion, not me, but polling companies have gauged opinion of British Muslims. And this is the reason I'm so concerned and why we do what we do. 0% of British Muslims have expressed any sympathy to homosexuality. A third, when polled in a different survey, expressed sympathy to the Charlie Hebdo killings. A third also expressed sympathy for the notion of resurrecting a caliphate. And when we talk about these numbers, I mean, give or take a few 0.01% margin of error, 0% expressing no toleration for homosexuality is a serious concern when we have ISIS throwing gays off the top of buildings. A third expressing the notion of romanticizing the resurrection of a caliphate. It should be concerning to us. And even if people often, I mentioned this stat once I was at Aspen, and I mentioned this, and I had somebody on the panel with me who was a Muslim, practicing religious headscarf wearing Muslim woman. And she said, oh, but that's not ISIS caliphate. And I said to her, look, a caliphate is a theocracy, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got a third of the population in America express sympathy for the return of the Crusades, but it's concerning whether it's the ISIS caliphate or not. Any notion of the resurrection of a theocracy in the modern day and age cannot be good for civilization. So when you speak in these terms, I think often people worry that you're generalizing, but actually I'd argue that currently, and the snapshot of time that we can survey at the moment, the statistics demonstrate a worrying trend, a very worrying trend. And what I've often said is that whereas Islamism, that I would define as the desire to impose a version of Islam over society, theocracy, Islamism needs to be intellectually terminated. Islam today, as the religion, requires reform. And so we're dealing with a twin challenge. I don't know if you'd agree, but I think from your last book, it indicates to me that you would. Mm-hmm. We're dealing with a twin challenge of the absolute necessity to completely, totally, civilizationally destroy Islamism, the ideology, and that's the desire to impose a version of Islam on society. But on top of that, the vast majority of Muslims who may not be Islamists, still the understanding of Islam they have, as demonstrated by statistics and polls and surveys, isn't where I'm comfortable with. And that's because, for whatever reason, that reform process, we may be going through it, but it hasn't completed. And I think that one thing I was impressed with in your latest book is your own emphasis on the need to start finding these reformers. You went country to country naming them, didn't you?
Yes.
I mean, she named me in the UK, which is, that's fine. But maybe talk a bit about that.
And Osama Hussein.
Yeah, Osama's here. So, yeah, we mentioned him. Yeah.
Yeah, so the way I see it, it's two different projects. One project is within the House of Islam, and I'm aware from your writings that you don't like the use of the term the House of Islam. Yeah. But this is what the radicals and the Islamists use. They conceive of a House of Islam. They conceive of the inhabitants of that House of Islam as the Ummah. And they want to unite the Ummah to gain this utopian state called the Caliphate. So what happens inside the House of Islam and the project of reformation, that is one project, one subject. The other is what happens in free societies and how they're affected by the Islamists. So when I talk about the rule of law, when I talk about the equality between men and women, gays, fighting anti-Semitism, fighting for the basic principles of democracy and the rule of law, that is a different. I feel as if, yes, there's a very good chance, and I see it much better than I did 5 or 6 years ago, that the House of Islam might be reformed because there's a group of people like you who are coming out and who are asking very basic questions and who hope through critical thinking to reform as in change, as in modify the basic tenets of Islam and to minimize and maybe marginalize the Medina Muslims, those with an agenda who want to impose Sharia law.
Yeah.
So that's one project, and that is what my last book was about. And then there is how do we preserve our own rights and freedoms and not descend into chaos. So if you take the two together, you would say, leaving aside political correctness, leaving aside the fringes, that we have an interest in supporting the modifiers. So in my book, I do not use the terms radical versus moderate, extreme versus moderate. I prefer, see, if you read and listen and focus on what the Islamists are telling you, they make this reference, and it's constant, to the Prophet Muhammad and trying to emulate him in the Quran. So if you take the Prophet Muhammad, you see that in the beginning when he was in Mecca, he was preaching. And what he was preaching is what we would define as religion now. When he goes to Medina, he starts to do other things. He starts to wage wars, he legislates, he is judge, jury, general, all at the same time. Now, the people who are Muslim, 1/5 of humanity, who emphasize, when they invoke the Prophet Muhammad, if they emphasize the Mecca period, I label them the Mecca Muslims. The others who invoke Muhammad and emphasize the Medina period and actively set out to Islamize the world through da'wah or mission work or jihad or a combination, I label them the Medina Muslims in that book. And then there's this third group, of which I think you are a member, who want to modify and change. And the enemy are the Medina Muslims. So in this confrontation between the Medina Muslims on the one hand and the modifying Muslims on the other, I think it is in our interest as free societies to side with the modifiers, to empower the modifiers, to expose the agenda of the Medina Muslims in pretty much the way we challenged the ideas of communism, the ideas of National Socialism, because these Medina Muslims promise a utopia that on paper may be appealing to those who are born into Islam, but in reality looks like what ISIS is performing.
Yeah. So on that last note, I just want to perhaps anecdotally mention to everyone here that in 2005 and 4, I was in prison in Egypt, in Mazra'at Tora prison in Cairo, with the who's who of the Islamist and jihadist leadership of Egypt at the time. So this is prior to ISIS creation. But we had the assassins of Sadat, the president of Egypt, was killed in 81. From Tanzim al-Jihad, who were with us in prison. We had Muhammad Badir, who's the leader of the Brotherhood, has since been re-imprisoned in Egypt, the leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Egypt. We had all the various Islamists from Ayman Zawahiri's jihad group through Gama'ah al-Islamiyya, and all the way through to liberal political prisoners such as Sa'd Ibrahim, who's the Egyptian-American sociologist, Democrat. One of the things that shocked me and forced my own thinking is the conversations we used to have in prison with the jihadists and the other Islamists. Because, of course, we grew up glorifying this caliphate that you said on paper looks very attractive to someone born and raised in the Muslim culture. It looked very attractive to me. And we were, no joke, we're in prison before ISIS creation, discussing the intricacies of when the caliphate comes, and these are jihadists talking to me about how it would be perfectly within their rights to enslave women. And this was in 2004 and 5. And so these conversations and this ideology was already in place. It often irks me when people say that I'm a moderate because I criticize ISIS. The definition of moderate is entirely relative. Look, even Al-Qaeda criticizes ISIS, right? Seriously, right? Al-Qaeda is fighting ISIS, yeah? The ideology that laid the principles, the groundwork for this kind of mindset was already there. It's what you've referred to. I call it Islamism. You've referred to it as the Medina period.
The Medina agenda.
People want to impose Islam. It was already there. We were teaching it. We already knew that whenever somebody declares a caliphate, there will be expansionist jihad, there will be enslavement, there will be all sorts of killings and murder. Misogyny, the killing gays off the top of buildings. My former group, Hizb ut-Tahrir, used to publish pamphlets with that. Omar Bakri used to lead the group, right? We used to publish pamphlets with that and mention that hadith and say this would be the punishment for gays in the caliphate, throwing them off the highest building in the city. It's exactly what ISIS is doing. So I have a personal history knowing, and everything ISIS is doing out there, I know we used to teach that stuff. And so it's no good us saying that's not our caliphate. I think the debate has to move, as you're saying, right down to the very notion of a theocracy in this day and age and whether it's good for anyone, or we call it a religiocracy, whatever word we want to use, the idea of imposing a version of Islam over society. And that's I think it's really good that this dialogue, this conversation,
Yeah.
is moving in this direction, because you and I think the dividing lines in this debate, I no longer believe, like I used to believe, that they're, what's pejoratively called the new atheists on the one side and Muslims on the other. That's not the dividing line, because actually even on those that we call the regressive left that I've just referred to, you've got atheists among them who defend Islamism, like Glenn Greenwald, defend Islamism to the core, right? There are atheists on that side of the debate as well. And I think that actually you and and I think your last book mentions this clearly, you call it the heretics, yeah? The book's called The Heretic. Actually, those who are willing to challenge the status quo in defense of universal human rights, liberal values, and freedoms are on one side of the debate. And then those who defend any form of theocratic or authoritarian ideals in the name of cultural tolerance are on the other side of the debate. And actually, we all have to stand together in solidarity, because your freedoms are my freedoms. Your freedom to leave the religion is my freedom to scrutinize it and reform it. It's one and the same freedom. And I just want to mention a good kind of nice anecdote here, because one of the plus sides to this dialogue with Sam Harris and with Ayaan, and to a lesser extent also with Richard Dawkins that I've been engaged in, is that it's actually had a really positive result for me. I mentioned Omar Bakri Muhammad, who used to lead Hizb ut-Tahrir in this country. He went off, anyone who knows his history will know, he went off and founded Al-Muhajirun. And Al-Muhajirun is the group that eventually was led by Anjem Choudhury in this country, which eventually morphed into the banned terrorist group Sharia for UK, which had franchised by then across Europe and into Australia, Sharia for Belgium, Sharia for Australia, which eventually morphed into ISIS. And almost all of the British foreign fighters who had gone to join ISIS had interactions with this offshoot of Al-Muhajirun, this manifestation of Omar Bakri's group in this country. And ISIS caliphate is all inspired by these sorts of ideas. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that one of the, for me, it really touched me, is that one of the good pieces of feedback I got after these sorts of dialogues that we've started, that Sam Harris and I have, that you and I have, is that there was a former member of Al-Muhajirun, i.e. a banned terrorist organization, who used to be with them 10 years ago and has been on his own journey. And he read the dialogue that Sam Harris and I had, called Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which focuses on this reform agenda that you've just been speaking of. And the culmination of that is that he has joined Quilliam. He's here today as well. His name's Adam Dean. And he's also working with us on the reform effort. Because one thing that struck him when he read that book was, I think he's told me that and he can speak for himself maybe in the Q&A, but that the understanding of Islamism and how we're focusing on this desire to impose Islam as an idea that we call Islamism that must be intellectually terminated, he said to me, crystallized through reading that dialogue, and he was very happy, and he's looking forward to meeting you at the dinner afterwards as well. But he's also been on a long journey, so we're really trying to build up this notion of Muslims who are willing to scrutinize their own tradition, our own tradition, your tradition as well, by the way, yeah? And your culture that you've grown up in as well. You have every right to own that and to debate it, and to push this debate forward in this way that you've just spoken about as well.
Maajid, I'm getting all kinds of hints that we're out of time.
Oh, she's there, yeah.
Yes.
I think we're going to do something a little bit different, have a little bit more time for Q&A. So I'd like to open the floor to some questions. Yes.
Thank you. And I think it's very greatly appreciated the work that you both do, particularly in combating extremism and anti-Semitism, which I think affects many people in this audience. The question is, in terms of practical terms, the tension between the free speech argument, shining the light of free speech, having free discussions in order to expose extremism, the tension between that and the need to use or to have restrictions on free speech in order to combat extremism. And particularly, I don't know whether you have a view, particularly Ayaan, on the government's prevent strategy, because this is quite controversial. It's a belief that you do need to combat extremism by clamping down on certain expressions of thought as against shining the light of free speech. Well, how do you view the tension between the need to combat extremism and the belief in free speech and the freedoms that you've talked about?
So I was called by Timothy Gatton Ash, a British intellectual. He called me an Enlightenment fundamentalist, a First Amendment fundamentalist. I do not believe in censorship. I think censorship is wrong. There is a reason why historically for hundreds of years, we ended up in the 20th century by saying, you know, it's better to combat bad speech with more speech. I think it would be more practical if Prevent invested in educating young people, in particular Muslims, about what the Medina agenda is. And to do that, we need free speech, because you're going to tell young people who now are told by their parents in Islamic centers, in Islamic schools, in madrasas, online, that the Prophet Muhammad was this perfect example, moral example for humanity. What they need to learn is he wasn't perfect. As a historical figure, you may want to categorize him as great, like Alexander the Great, or any of those big historical figures that we read about. But what he did in Medina is not something that should be emulated now. And if it is, it leads to ISIS. We did this after National Socialism and after communism. Young people in Europe were educated on these utopian ideas and ideals and the people who push them. And I think young people should know, as by the time you're age 14, 15, like those 3 girls who disappeared from Bethnal Green, by that time they should have known. You should be able to tell the difference between right and wrong. And the fact that they can't tell is a failure of our education system. And in order to improve our education system, we need to protect free speech. We need more speech, not censorship.
I agree with that, and I don't believe in no platforming. I don't believe in the safe space culture that the NUS has decided to adopt, the mollycoddling and the suffocating of conversation that leads eventually to, I've said, the left are eating the leftovers, right? So the NUS just recently banned Peter Tatchell, right? They banned Hope Not Hate, which is a group that works on anti-racism. I don't agree with much of some of, actually the last thing, I was quite critical of them because they did something really bad and naughty, but they shouldn't be banned. So there's a left eating the leftovers, they're eating themselves, that's what it leads to. Theresa May's view that you know platform, what she calls non-violent extremists, is not, I don't think that's the way forward. I think Cameron has got it right, not Theresa May. Actually, the way forward is to challenge them, is to call them out, is to do what we did to racism, is to do what we did to homophobia. Anti-Semitism. It's to make it a taboo to be a Muslim theocrat. Currently, being a homophobe is a taboo, being a racist is a taboo, being anti-Semitic is a taboo, but being a Muslim theocrat somehow is authentic and real. Right? And that's what we've got to challenge, yeah.
Good evening. I work with, I've been doing some work for a British charity called Karma Nirvana, which protect and offer refuge to British citizens that are the victims of honour violence and forced marriage. And one of the biggest challenges that the charity have is getting into educational institutions, schools, universities, to talk about the work they do and reach potential victims. Now, the reason it's a challenge is because so many of the head teachers and heads of universities are petrified of offending both the students and the teachers. And so that's a real challenge for Karma Nirvana. Now, I've read your books, both of you, and it's clear to me, as I'm sure it's clear to any sane person that's read them, that the place for these books is absolutely within educational institutions. They should be in libraries at the least, and they really ought to be part of a balanced religious education within the curriculum. So my question to both of you is, how much success, if any, have you had in getting your books and films into educational institutions in both the UK and America and beyond?
Mm-hmm.
I've been working a lot on, by the way, I know of Karma Nirvana, AHA Foundation and Karma Nirvana work together. I admire their work. Thank you for everything you do. It is, in terms of success, I wouldn't claim, if we were discussing, if this was Wall Street and they said, just give me the bottom line, I would say in terms of awareness, people talking about it, we've been successful. We've not been successful in getting through. Again, it is this taboo thing. It's the fact that our elite is refusing to recognize that we are facing people who come from cultures that do not see women and men as equal, not before the law, not in front of their fathers and mothers, not on the street. Women are chattel. They can be forced into marriage because the parents, the guardian, the male guardians feel she's a property. Now, by saying that, I'm not generalizing. I'm not saying every Muslim male or every man who comes from North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia believes or practices that. But so many of them do, too many, that make these victims that you work with. And that what we are seeing is only the tip of the iceberg. And in order to change this, when people come here in this different culture, we have to uphold the rule of law. If you do not protect the victim indoors from a forced marriage or a genital mutilation or honor violence or an honor killing, as a society, we end up failing to protect women in public. So for me, the mass rapes and sexual harassments on the public square coming from the same men who grew up in that same culture and what they do to their women in private, it is linked. And it is to uphold the rule of law. It is to develop a framework that educates these men to set aside the notion that men and women are unequal, that women are chattel. And that education should be backed with force. It should be very, very painful to hurt a woman, the no harm principle, whether she's your little daughter, whether she's your wife, or whether she's a public woman, a woman in public. And if we fail to do that, we're going to have to live with the consequences. So in terms of measuring success, I think we've achieved that. We can talk about it, but it's far from eliminated.
Yeah, there's institutional resistance, I'd say, at the moment. And I think, again, to draw the analogy, I think this debate will move the way that racism and homophobia did. That it begins with a civil society discourse. The institutions catch up last. And I think that's where we're going to go with this. Because institutions always take a long while to change. And that's what the term institutionalized means. And they are inherently resistant to change. And currently this culture of being offended at anything and everything is what dominates. But public opinion is changing. Because we had the Birmingham schools situation with the Trojan horse affair. People are beginning to, Ofsted, the culture in Ofsted, which is the education standards body, that in itself is changing because people are beginning to realize that there needs to be a culture shift. But we stand at this precipice, and I think these sorts of conversations are what help push that along, but it's a slow burner.
But it should happen faster. I mean, we should really start going now because we are going to have wave after wave after wave of immigrants from the Middle East, from North Africa, from South Asia, where that type of culture is predominant. So the longer we wait, the harder it gets to face these challenges.
I would like to ask you a question about anti-Semitism. I'd like to... Actually, I saw an ISIS recruitment video the other day, and I was interested that it didn't mention Israel, it didn't mention Jews at all.
Yeah.
Which surprised me. Am I right to be surprised? Or, on the other hand, the question is, why is anti-Semitism so important to Islamist politics? Or is it? Is it central, or have I got that wrong?
No, it is crucial to part of the hate rhetoric, but Israel isn't, strategically, Israel isn't their first goal. So if you think back, so you shouldn't be surprised in answer to your question. If you think back to bin Laden and look at his propaganda, it feels like the classical days of jihad, doesn't it, when we talk about bin Laden? But if you look at his propaganda, you notice he focused on Israel very little. And his main focus was on overthrowing, well, actually it was twofold. It was to attack the West for the purpose of forcing the West to bear the consequences of Western support for Arab dictators, to have that support withdrawn so that the Arab dictators will fall and so a caliphate could be established in their ashes, and then that caliphate would attack Israel. So it was last in the line of things that bin Laden wanted. And that's exactly the blueprint ISIS is working towards. Their view is, let's secure the caliphate, let's focus on the immediate challenges of those attacking the caliphate, including Iran and the Shia sectarian and Wahhabi sectarian war that's going on. Once the caliphate is secure and it's got its Sunni territory secured, it will then focus on conquering Israel. And so that's why primarily their focus at the moment is on demonstrating that they are a viable. We've analysed their propaganda at Quilliam, at ISIS propaganda. We've broken down actually where most of their propaganda focuses on is actually not what we see in the news. The large bulk of their propaganda focuses on demonstrating that they are a viable state and that their utopia is functioning. Then, of course, there are the brutality videos, which are done specifically for the purpose of grabbing our attention. But they're the minority of videos. So their main aim at the moment is to actually convince other Muslims that their utopia is working, that they have a viable state, so that people come and join them and support them. And then Israel will be the next thing. But in terms of anti-Semitism, that is a pillar of Islamist ideology. And the reason it is Islamism as an ideology, like fascism, like Nazism, requires an external enemy. You always need the evil enemy that you can blame all the Muslims' ills on. And you know, it was the same with Hitler, and it was the same with Mussolini. You need the external other. And any form of genocide, likewise in Rwanda, you know, you need the kind of the dehumanized or subhuman other to galvanize people and say, that's the enemy, go and get them. And likewise with, unfortunately, with Islamism as well.
I agree with Maajid, and the only thing I would add, just 2 quick points, is it is an official policy of Iran to destroy Israel. And it is rightfully so that Israel is probably more worried today about Iran than they are worried about ISIS. It's an official policy of Saudi Arabia to destroy Israel. And Saudi Arabia is not going to send troops or throw rockets at, but will give money to all kinds of non-state actors that will do that, finance, in madrasas, Islamic centers, that sort of, you know, thinking about the Jewish state. And I think the one thing that makes it extremely is the scapegoat bit of it. But these countries, none of these countries are democracies. Some of them are aspiring to be theocracies. Iran is a theocracy, Saudi Arabia is a theocracy, and then all these other jihadists are aspiring to be theocracies, or they are not theocracies like Egypt. But one thing that really, really is a thorn in their eye is the fact that this small state, Israel, has in fact accomplished a democracy in the Middle East. And that makes it, and they're terrified of that, that the Arab public, who are now told day in, day out that the framework of a democracy and the rule of law is evil because it's secular, it is ungodly, it is un-Arab, this and that, could see this nation that is in fact peaceful and prosperous. And if you look at, and I really urge you all to visit Israel and take time to engage with the Arab minority in Israel, and you will see a completely different picture. To live as an Arab in that entire region, you're most comfortable.
In fact,
unless you are extremely wealthy and male, you're very comfortable being an Arab Israeli.
So on that point, actually, when surveyed, because I wrote about this, because you know we spoke about the hypocrisy of those who support lifting the sanctions against Iran, at the same time want to impose sanctions on Israel. And I wrote about this, actually, when surveyed, again, stats don't lie, right? And they've done these polls on Arab Israelis. When polled, Arab Israelis were asked, when a Palestinian state comes into existence, would you stay here in Israel and be Israeli citizens, Arab Israeli Muslims, or would you want to live in the Palestinian state? And the majority said they'd rather stay in Israel. Right, so they want to stay in Israel. That surprised me when I saw, because I used to, obviously, being Hizb ut-Tahrir, I used to be completely, not just anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, I'm ashamed to say. And I've been on my journey, I've visited Israel, I think 3 times now. And I've, you know, my own views on this have changed, right? So when I first came across that poll, I realized actually there's an untapped resource that Israel has. And that's why actually I think there's a charity called here, the Abraham Fund, that seeks to promote the voices of Arab Israelis. And they're having a dinner soon in London, actually. And I'd suggest everyone looks into them, because if you can amplify the voices of Israeli Arabs to speak of their experiences, it can only enrich that conversation.
Yeah.
Hi, hi Maajid. Haven't seen you around for a while.
How are you? Sorry, there's a torchlight in my face, so I'm
okay.
guessing from your voice, but
the Camden Liberal Democrats.
yes, absolutely.
Come back to us. No, I wanted to ask, because I was very interested in the Mecca.
That always has to happen, doesn't it?
The Mecca Medina
Yeah.
dichotomy, I suppose. And
Mecca Medina modifiers.
and how you were talking about how there needs to be reform within Islam. And Maajid, you did touch on this very briefly, but in a different context. I wondered how you see the Sunni-Shia divide and what impact and influence that tension has and will have on your plans for reform.
So to be very clear, the distinctions between Islamists on the one hand, who I say need to be civilizationally, intellectually terminated. I say intellectually on purpose, and no one accuses me of being a warmonger. They need to be intellectually destroyed as an idea. It has absolutely zero credibility as far as I'm concerned, as a notion. It has the same level of credibility as anybody who says to me they want to resurrect the Holy Roman Empire, right? You're talking about resurrecting caliphate. So you've got the Islamists, and then, as we discussed, you've got Muslims who adhere to a let's say, either Puritan or conservative with a small c, or literalist version of the faith. The majority of Muslims today around the world would fit under the Puritan conservative bracket, in that they wouldn't match the liberal human rights standards. When surveyed, we know this. So those divides exist whether you're Sunni or Shia. Islamism, you can be a Shia Islamist, you can be a Shia jihadist, and you can be a Sunni Islamist and a Sunni jihadist. To give you an example of both, Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Shia jihadist terrorist group currently fighting alongside Assad in Syria against the Syrian uprising. Hamas is a Sunni jihadist terrorist group based in Gaza, trying to attack Israeli civilians. You can also be a Sunni Islamist. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood are Sunni Islamists who aren't terrorists, but they're seeking a theocracy. You can be a Shia Islamist. A non-terrorist supporter of the Iranian regime is a Shia Islamist. So the Islamism conservative Muslim distinctions apply to Sunnis and Shia. Islamism as an idea succeeded in coming to power in the Shia context in the form of Iran. It's failed on multiple occasions in the Sunni context. Sudan was an experiment, Afghanistan was an experiment, but it keeps falling apart. So the Shia have realized in the form of Iran the Shia Islamist state, and Sunnis are still seeking it, right? But the same thing applies there. As for on the religious side, there is a sectarian tension that has risen and become more acute of late. And that primarily is something that both Saudi Arabia and Iran have geopolitical interests in resurrecting. But I think, again, the more secular the discourse could possibly become in the future, the less Islamism and sectarian religious differences will matter. And so I think the reform debate will actually help on both of those fronts. I hope that addresses what you had in mind. I don't know if you want to add something there.
I just think that Medina is so much simpler than all these other.
Yeah.
In other words, if you take the umbrella of people who want to follow in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad and resurrect that time, because that's when they think the caliphate started, then under that umbrella of Medina, you have Sunnis, you have Shias, you have those who want to do it like the Muslim Brotherhood in non-violent way. But this is not a disagreement. This is merely a semantic disagreement. I think my way is simpler.
I'll say Medina to make, Medina Muslims, yeah.
Thank you very much. Good evening. A lot of us who are watching what's happening with the formation of ISIS, and how many people from the West, from the UK, from Europe, suddenly caught up in this idea and go and fight for ISIS, and are ready to die for ISIS and to kill others, and give up the ideas that we think are so wonderful: freedom, democracy. I think it's a real shock to a lot of us, and I'm wondering whether, the West is losing the war for ideas.
Yes.
What could it be that is so appealing to young people who, many of whom are born here, second, third generation, who are ready to give it all up? And should we be more proactive in promoting the ideals of Western civilization, of democracy, in our educational system, throughout the initiatives inside our countries?
Absolutely. I think it is, ISIS is a blessing and a curse at the same time. I've been watching the Muslim Brotherhood as a movement, going into, talking to individuals, going into families, into neighborhoods, and selling the idea of the caliphate, as does Hizb ut-Tahrir and a myriad other Salafi organizations, all of them under that umbrella of Medina Islam. And as they are disseminating this information about the caliphate and the wonders of the caliphate and the utopia and how we'll all be liberated, and so we'll be liberated from what it is to be human and defiling everything that the West has achieved, I think we allowed these activists to make use of the freedom of speech, which they only want to use it for themselves, but not for everyone else. The freedom of association. We've even helped them with welfare. They use the freedom of religion. So they use all of these pillars of our society to promote and indoctrinate young children. And all along, we've been self-inhibiting, we've been self-censoring, and feeling, well, we can't tell these brown children that maybe the Magna Carta is much more valuable than the message of Muhammad. We've been self-deluding, and we've been committing a cultural suicide, we've been committing a civilizational suicide. I think it's not too late. I think the history of the United Kingdom proves, and the history of Europe proves, that these ideas of the Enlightenment are much stronger and much more enduring. But you do need energy, you need to push them. And you need to have them from pre-kindergarten, I don't know what, you say nursery?
Nursery.
From nursery school to university. We need to be able to engage and capture the imagination of young people more than the people whom we've allowed to take advantage and destroy our freedoms have done. It's our fault. It's our fault. It's our education system.
So on that note, that's a good question. And you mentioned the numbers that have gone to join ISIS. Look, we've got up to 2,000. Up to 2,000, some say, but the figures vary between 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 British born and raised Muslims who've gone to join ISIS, men and women, yeah? Up to 5,000, 6,000 across Europe. And it's interesting that the vast majority of these, if not the overwhelming majority or all of them, have been born and raised here. Or, like Muhammad Amwazi, have come up through here from primary school, Jihadi John, yeah? From primary school to secondary school to university level education. Yeah. So they are westernized in all sense of the word. They speak fluent English. As we heard Jihadi John's accent, I was just right behind you there is my friend Dean Godson, who I was having breakfast with this morning. We were speaking about exactly this topic. Dean and I have worked together a lot on counter-extremism. He runs Policy Exchange. We've spoken about this topic because there's a push at the moment to talk about English language and integration. And I just want to make something very clear. Integration of immigrants and integration of the first generation of Muslims is important in itself because, of course, a Muslim mother or grandmother who comes here, if we can help her with skills and training and she can get a job, she stands on her own 2 feet, and that's women's empowerment. It can only ever be a good thing. But that's very different to the extremism debate. And we've got to be very clear here because sometimes our own prejudices blind us from where extremism is coming from. Extremism is coming from people who look and sound exactly like us and speak fluent English, in the Western context that is, yeah? Speak fluent English, have been educated in some of the best universities in this country. The man who beheaded Daniel Pearl in Pakistan went to LSE.
Yes.
Omar something, he went to the LSE. Muhammad Amwazi went to the University of Westminster. Yes. The shoe bomber went to, the Christmas Day bomber went to the UCL. I was at SOAS, right? So these are people who I have a law and Arabic degree. You know, the LSE is the LSE, right? At the age of 17, I was recruiting from Oxford and Cambridge. These are people who look and sound like us, but our own prejudices means that we want them to be foreigners. They're not. And what that tells us is something, as you pointed out, has gone wrong, as Ayaan is saying, in the integration process of those who are born and raised here. And what's gone wrong is that we have been self-inhibiting. We haven't been emphasizing why we fought so hard in Europe for those liberal democratic values of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the universal values that we've come to cherish and come to take for granted. We've stopped talking about them as a good thing. That's what we've done. Now, those 2,000, up to 2,000 that went from Britain to join ISIS, I often say, so people understand what we're saying here, It's impossible that that could have emerged from a vacuum. 2,000 people don't just up and leave to join the worst terrorist group history has known overnight. ISIS plucked the low-hanging fruit, and the reason they were able to is that for decades, while we weren't preaching the importance of Enlightenment values, Islamists like I used to be were preaching on the grassroots the importance of Islamism. And they've been doing it unchecked. We talk about the importance of debate and challenging them. They've been doing it unchecked for decades, to the extent that in 1994, here in London, in Wembley Arena, I was involved. We organized an international caliphate conference where 12,000 people attended, right, to speak about the resurrection of the caliphate, and ISIS eventually created it.
Yeah.
So we've been doing this unchecked for decades in these societies across Europe, and that's why ISIS was able to pluck the low-hanging fruit, and that's why those numbers have gone over, because the only thing that was ever being portrayed to these young kids as a good idea that gives you power, identity, belonging, a sense of self was Islamism. We weren't doing the same for the Enlightenment values. And so that's important to mention, that actually we have to start speaking about the Enlightenment values as a good thing.
Yeah. Maajid, can I just please give me one?
Sure, go for it,
I
please,
absolutely
absolutely.
agree with
Yeah.
everything you said. I just want to add, and I want to provoke you in this, and I hope, Alan, I can be here 10 years from now and see how the provocation worked out. You cannot criticize in a meaningful way National Socialism without raising the subject of Hitler. If you take history in this country and the rest of the West, you get to learn a lot about Hitler. What he wrote, how he came to power, how he was defeated, and on. You cannot have a meaningful criticism of communism unless you talk about Karl Marx. You cannot and will not have a meaningful criticism of Islamism or the Medina agenda and
Without talking about the
resonate
Prophet
with young
Muhammad.
people without talking about the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
And that is now called blasphemy. And to criticize Muhammad is criminalized. My challenge to you is we've got to resist that. I hope 10 years from now I'll be here and that we've won the hearts and minds of young Muslims in Britain by telling them of the dark side of Muhammad.
So this is why I tweeted out a year before the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Sorry, we're extending this bit a bit, but I think you've raised something really important. And I want to say this here as a Muslim, and there are Muslims in the audience, and I want to be very clear on this. A year before the Charlie Hebdo attacks, I tweeted out an image of a stick figure called Mo, saying hi to a stick figure called Jay, representing Muhammad and Jesus, and Mo was saying hi, and Jay said, "How you doing?" And it was actually during the parliamentary campaign that this was my constituency, and I didn't win, otherwise I'd be your MP. It was during my parliamentary campaign in this area. Some of you may remember it. Those of here who were campaigning with me do remember it, because it led to multiple death threats. Nick Clegg, that was then Deputy Prime Minister, had to intervene in the public media. It led to ISIS death threats. We installed a panic alarm. The police installed a panic alarm in my home. The reason I did this was to make this point, right? Yeah. That when I say Islamism needs to be intellectually terminated and Islam today needs to be reformed, the second part of that sentence cannot happen without a fair, free, and frank conversation about Prophet Muhammad. Yeah. It cannot happen. We have to, as Muslims, open up this conversation and accept what isn't accepted at the moment, that not everything he did should be emulated today.
Oh, he's just perfect.
That's what I say, yeah.
Immaculate.
We've got to open that up, right?
Yeah.
We've got to open that up, and unless that's opened up in a brave and frank and candid way, this debate will not move forward.
No.
It will not move forward. And there are people at Quilliam who are the Reformed theologians, and in that team, who I know because I speak to them, who from a theological background are imams and are trained, like we have one who's at Azhar Mosque,
Yes.
Azhar University, trained at the foremost Sunni school of learning. I think he's here tonight as well. Imam Salahi was an imam at Palmer's Green Mosque. I know, because I speak with these guys, we're all on the same page with this. Yeah. We've got to say that not everything is to be copied and imitated from the 7th century.
Has to be the mothers and the fathers.
Yeah.
It has to be.
That's right.
You see, if your father and mother tell you from the very beginning, he's perfect and immaculate, as my father and mother have done. So when these figures come, the Islamists, and start indoctrinating us as teenagers, and they say, all you have to do is follow in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad. And so as a young person, it's extremely, extremely difficult to go against your father and
Yeah.
your mother and your community and your teachers and everyone else. So it is, the we is not just
Yeah.
the intellectual elite on
Absolutely.
stages addressing it. It is telling to the face of a mother and a father, if your child sneaked out to ISIS and you are very sad about it, and we share the responsibilities. Maybe there was something the police should have done, maybe something teachers should have done, maybe the peer group should have done something, but what is it you told your child about the Prophet Muhammad?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's very confrontational, and
Yeah,
it's
and-
very sensitive,
And I'm
but
under
it's the
no,
way forward.
I'm under no illusion that even in your modifier bracket,
Yeah.
this view that I've just
Yes,
espoused
exactly,
is a
yes.
modifier of the modifiers.
That
'cause
is the modifier.
It's a tiny minority who are
Yeah.
going to say what you just said.
Yeah.
It's very controversial at the moment, but that has to be opened up. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to sound like an American and say, we can do it.
Okay, I'm going to play, devil's advocate for a moment. After everything you've said about sort of really making sure that that Muslims understand the danger of their religion, etc., etc., etc.,
Of Muhammad.
and having systems in place to do with education, to do with making sure that people aren't radicalized. How would you then, looking at the camp on the other side of the channel, which is a spit away from us, where you have an awful lot of people suffering, how would you deal with that? And how would you bring them over here and make sure that they're given good homes and that we can take care of them?
Are you talking about refugees?
Yeah.
But your question is related to refugees, yeah? That's right. Regardless of whether some people, because obviously there are others among them, but you're talking about genuine refugees.
Yeah, I'm talking about all of them. I'm talking about all of them because it's such a tragic sight and it's such a tragedy that happens in this day and age.
Mm. Mm. Do you want to go first? It's up to you,
Yeah, well, so, and I think you see the labels, refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, it doesn't matter. On the other side, people are facing economic challenges. They're facing law and order challenges. They're facing civil war. And many of them, millions of them, want to come here. And this is what we've been talking all evening. I think that every country has to decide, in terms of capacity, how many people they can really absorb without descending into chaos. And the European Union, along with Britain, have really neglected to develop a foreign policy and a military policy that takes into account what is happening in their neighborhood. So that what we are seeing now from our governments is a reaction to a crisis, not a proactive anticipation of the events there and the effects that they're going to have on us. What we can anticipate now, as we sit here, is in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see millions of people attempt to come in, and yes, many millions of them will come in. And so how do we address it? I would say, again, go back to the rule of law. No more political correctness or self-censorship and all of that nonsense. The whole multiculturalism nonsense has to go out, and establish institutionally and empower and finance the enforcers of the rule of law. Establish now a foreign policy and a military policy that is able to somehow somehow order it. We can't have everybody come in. We can't leave everybody who's suffering out. People, dead bodies washing up is not what we want. It's not what we think. But there's a way of doing it, and there's going to be a lot of tragedy. It's going to be a lot of tragedy, but the answer simply does not lie in what we've been doing now, which has been sticking our heads in the sand, and that affects the poorest people here. And the poorest people here are now facing all kinds of economic challenges. Social cohesion is challenged in every way possible. The far-right parties all over Europe are on the rise. In Scandinavia, people are buying more guns than in the United States in proportion to their population because they don't believe in the police, they don't trust the police. Again, we've talked about the mass sexual harassments and rapes, and at the same time, the need for people to come in who are suffering, that is real. And I'm afraid our leadership have not really anticipated this.
So on the, I'm not going to make any assumptions about your question in terms of where you're coming from, so please don't assume that from my answer. But the short answer is I write a weekly column for the Daily Beast and I address these things regularly, so please read some of those columns. But I will, your question is really important. I think between xenophobia and xenophilia, there is a middle ground to be struck here. And putting Trump to one end of the sort of spectrum that we're discussing, and ideas of building a wall and ridiculous notions of dipping bullets in pig's blood to shoot Muslims, you've also got what I think naivety is too kind a word for Angela Merkel's policy. Yeah. And the reason I say that is because we've got a referendum coming up here in the UK about whether we should stay or leave the European Union on June the 23rd, I think. And somebody like me, who is in principle pro-EU and pro-refugees, is very worried that with the sorts of policies that Merkel has introduced, she's basically providing fodder for people to vote for Brexit and to leave for the UK to leave the European Union. So we've got to put the importance of the refugee agenda in the overall framework of what's going on to the geopolitical scene within the European Union. And that is the rise of far-right parties and populist parties. What I would say, and I'm giving you a condensed answer version of it, but what I would say is that the challenge is less so in our duty to protect refugees, which is there, and we have to honour that duty. It's more so in what Ayaan was addressing, and that is what we do when refugees are in our country, and that's about integration, and it's about education programs, it's about citizenship programs that emphasize the culture in this country. The New York Times recently ran an article, and they interviewed a refugee who was attending a voluntary program about women's rights, which it's voluntary at the moment in Europe. And he said, this has really been really valuable for me because, quote, I'm not making this up. He said, because in the country I come from, he was a Muslim.
Eritrea.
Yeah, you've read it. He said, in the country I come from, we're used to taking women, stealing them from the streets and raping them, and then they get married to us. It literally said, that's a quote from the guy, right? That he gave to the New York Times.
He said, if I want a woman, I take her when I'm in Eritrea.
Yeah, I take her off the street, rape her, and her family will marry her to me to save themselves the shame of me having raped her, right? So you've got somebody who's, whether that's a generalization of his own culture or not, somebody who's got that concept in his head, who's come to Europe and is willing to speak about it to the press. So we've got a situation where people often say, is our culture better than other cultures? I'm sorry. I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that universal, liberal, democratic human rights standards are better than that anecdote that this gentleman has related, right? So when we're fulfilling our duty as human beings to our refugees, we have to basically have, not voluntary, I wrote about this in my, I don't think they should be voluntary. I think as part of the citizenship program, this stuff should be taught. That what is the culture of the country you have sought to make your home? You want to live here, this is how this works. That can only help these vulnerable individuals when it comes to skills, jobs, language, and their economic and cultural status. It can only help them. I know because I come from those communities where even in my own close family members, some of them still don't speak English, and the difficulties in getting jobs and the economic challenges that poses. And then what that does is it hinders their ability to be role models as mothers and aunties and grandmothers for their kids who then join extremist groups who have been born and raised here, right? So we have to fix this problem, and that means not shying away from the fact that some things are better that we have here, and I would say very clearly they are the liberal human rights democratic values that we've come to cherish.
Foundation, Ayaan and Maajid, thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.